So the goal is to go through epilepsy. For some of you, depending on where you're at with your journey, this might be like, yep, been there, know that. And for others, maybe it's new. And then we'll go through a little bit of information just about, things for you to know, tricks, keys, I guess. And like I said, meant to be interactive. So if you're someone here living with epilepsy and you have a thought on any of this, or you have a resource that I left out, please just jump right on in. Sound good? Okay, here we go. All right, we're not even going to go through that. Okay, so for anyone who does not know this, I wanted to put this out there and kind of normalize how common epilepsy actually is. So epilepsy is the 4th most common neurologic disorder, only behind migraine, stroke, and Alzheimer. It's also, I think we all know this number pretty well, the 1 in 26 people in the U.S. that have epilepsy. It's actually more common than autism, MS, and Parkinson's combined. So if you kind of think about how much knowledge we have about a lot of those diagnoses. And then there's about 3 million people, they guesstimate, in the U.S. with epilepsy, and they guess somewhere around 50 million in the world. I would guess that number is probably actually higher. And 1 in 10 people will have at least one seizure in their lifetime, which I think most of us have heard that number too. So let's go through briefly, what is epilepsy? So what is a seizure? Let's start there, because we're going to talk about that seizure and epilepsy don't technically automatically go together. So a seizure, I always like to point this out, literally means to take hold, right? If you seize somebody's property, you are taking their property. So it's a very accurate term for what happens during a seizure, because it takes over our body, or in whatever fashion that looks like. Any brain's capable of having a seizure, which is why 1 in 10 people, even if they don't go on to develop epilepsy, will have a seizure in their lifetime. There's a lot of different conditions that can sort of predispose the brain to having a seizure, and we'll go through those a little bit more as we go down our list. Oh, hold on, I think I skipped 2. Wait for it. There we go. Okay. So what actually happens during a seizure? This is more than anybody here probably ever wanted to know, but I'm a science nerd, so I think it's interesting, and there will not be a quiz after. So seizures are a result of a shift in the normal balance of the excitation and the inhibition within the central nervous system. So you have all these neurotransmitters swimming in the brain. Some excite, some bring down, but when anything kind of rocks that balance, that's when we can see seizures happen. I listed a few other neurons on there for anybody who's really interested in the names. So when does a seizure become epilepsy? Anybody know the answer? You don't look at the screen. Okay. Okay. What else? Anybody else been told? I'm cheating because I put it up there already. What is it? I know you know. There you go. So the rule of thumb tends to be once you've had 2 or more unprovoked seizures. The term unprovoked matters a lot, because if somebody gets stone cold drunk and has a withdrawal seizure, that we know why that happened, right? It wasn't because something was really abnormal. That is a natural response, as we can withdraw. So typically it's 2 or more unprovoked seizures. However, if you have other factors in there, for example, let's say you've had a traumatic brain injury or you've had a stroke before, they will often diagnose epilepsy after only 1 seizure. So there's some variability in that, but that's typically what we think of with the difference. So epilepsy causes is about 50-50, meaning about 50% of the time we know why, and about 50% of the time we don't, which is fascinating. We have a lot to learn still. In our bucket of reasons we know why, and I'm not going to read all these because we're going to go into them more, we kind of think of people who are predisposed, so we're thinking genetic, and then we have things like injury to the brain in some fashion. And we loop those together and say, okay, we know why you have epilepsy. But 50% of people not knowing is a really large number still. All right, so this is technically the adult room, but we're going to briefly just chat about a few of the typical causes when we loop people into age groups. I'm going to hit that mic. All right, so we've got newborns, and you're going to see some repetitiveness here. So we have things like a brain malformation, so something just structurally, right, when they're being built in mom's tummy. Sometimes there can be things that happen either in utero or as they come out. So things like a lack of oxygen. You can have things like low blood sugar levels or electrolyte imbalances in that newborn age that also can cause it. So there's a bunch of different things. There's also a lot of genetic conditions, and there's a lot of people here, I think, that probably have a loved one that has a genetic cause behind it. And there's some very interesting presentations today and some interesting booths trying to start understanding more about that. When we move into childhood, this top list applies to babies too. It's just that we don't always know when they're newborns that they have these conditions yet, right? So we have things like Down syndrome or Angelman or TS or neurofibromatosis. The list kind of goes on here. Then there's also generalized seizure disorders. So juvenile absence, juvenile myoclonic, generalized idiopathic epilepsy. And then just like the adults, kids can also have a structural reason, like they fall off their bike, have a bad head injury, a car accident, things like that. In adults, the most common cause of epilepsy tends to be structural, meaning, and now we're referring to if you start having seizures as an adult. The most common is structural. And the reason for that is that if you had one of these other ones, these more genetic causes, you'd have started having seizures probably before adulthood. So that's kind of why we see the number be higher. But when we think structural, kind of thinking any kind of bruise or hit to the head, right? So that can include things inside like a stroke. It can include head trauma, traumatic brain injuries, concussions, any kind of that. There's also infections, so things like a meningitis or an encephalitis that can go and you have an acute infection in the brain, and afterwards it's kind of left its mark. There's something off a little bit structurally. And then there's autoimmune, which is also something that I think we're learning more about. I think it tends to get a little bit underdiagnosed, to be honest, because when an adult starts having seizures, we just say, okay, you have seizures. And we don't always dig in right away. So I don't know that we always know about that. So here's my beautiful little chart that I made on my own, but kind of stole from what the ILAE put out. Does anybody know what ILAE stands for? I love their name. Anybody brave enough to say it? Okay, it's the International League Against Epilepsy. Here's why I like it. It sounds like a superhero name, right? Like we're the League Against Epilepsy. That's just me. So they are the international hub, and they put together a lot of information looking at all of the information worldwide. So they're a great resource. In 2017, they kind of sat down and decided that we should get a little bit more commonality in our names of the terms we use. So we're going to go through that a little bit more because I want everybody to walk out here smarter than I am and know all these terms. But when we think about seizures, you can kind of put it in two main umbrellas. I know I have a third, but the third is the question mark. So two main umbrellas. You have a focal onset seizure and you have generalized seizures. A focal onset seizure, why does it move? Go back. A focal onset seizure can progress to a generalized seizure, but it still starts in one place. And for the adults in the room, focal onset epilepsy is the most common that starts in adulthood. Again, because generalized, often you just would have had one by then, but not always. And I'll come back to this slide so you don't have to memorize it. All right, let's look at a few of these terms. You do not have to memorize these, but since we're all sitting here together, we're going to look at what the new and approved terminology is. First one, unconscious, impaired aware, just sounds fancier. This one's interesting, actually, these couple here. A lot of people still refer to seizures as partial, simple partial, complex partial. They're trying to kind of do away with that term. The reason that they're doing away with it is that they really want the term itself to speak to what is actually happening. Right? So partial implies that it's a part of the brain. Focal aware, we have focal impaired aware. These ones sort of loop it back in that it's starting in that one spot, that focal onset, just one little area may spread. So that is a little bit more of where they're moving in those. We have dyscognitive I personally have never actually heard this word used, but apparently it was out there, so I don't know if anybody else has. But we're referring to those as the focal impaired awareness, meaning you're not aware anymore, right? Psychic seizures was a term that was used a lot years ago. I don't think it is as much, but we kind of refer to that one now as more of a cognitive seizure. And we'll talk about what falls, we'll talk about what falls into there. Then we have secondary generalized tonic-clonic. Now we're referring to it as a focal bilateral tonic-clonic. So the idea here is that when you use the term, we want people to see that you have focal epilepsy. It just spread to a generalized seizure. So the idea is clarity. Okay, we have a few different words here that we just loop behavioral arrest under. And then these two are also ones that I think get used a lot. Some of you might even still refer to your seizures, and that's okay. But grand mal, we use the word generalized seizure, or petite mal, we use the word focal seizure. Now, if you refer to yours as one of these, you are not wrong. I just bring it up so that way if somebody down the road says, oh, you have a focal seizure, and you go, no, I don't, I have a petite mal, you would know that these are kind of the same terms that we're talking about. Any questions on any of those? Yes, ma'am. You know, I could find a way to get you a copy of it, absolutely. Remind me afterwards. All right, few more terminologies. This is not new terminology. This is just so we know what we're talking about. Atonic means loss of muscle tone. You have an atonic seizure. People kind of refer to it as a drop seizure. Then you have tonic, meaning muscles become really stiff. You have a clonic, which is now more of that rhythmic movement. You have myoclonic, which is also a quick rhythmic movement, but we refer to it more like a jerk because it's really brief. And then you have the combo with a tonic-clonic seizure where you sort of have the stiffness with the intermittent jerking. Last terminology slide, I promise. I know you're all thinking that you didn't know you were going to school today. Ictal. That means during the seizure. So if you're in an ictal period, you are in the seizure, which then means that post-ictal means after the seizure, and interictal means between, right? So if somebody, I think we all know the post-ictal word pretty well, because I think a lot of us know what those post-ictal symptoms for us look like. But just, again, terminology. Seizure semiology is a very fancy word that neurologists like to throw around. That just means sort of what does it look like. That's really boiled down what it means. Your seizure semiology is what happens when you have a seizure. Do you lip smack? Do you shake? Whatever that is for you, that's your semiology. Emotional, so we'll talk more about this, but you can have emotional responses during seizures. I skipped one, sorry. Automatism, another fancy word people like to use. It really just means some kind of a repetitive movement that's not intentional. So a common automatism is something like a hand, you can't see me now, like a hand wiping like this. I can hand wipe, I'm not having a seizure. The difference is when somebody's doing it, they're not in control of that movement. Other examples are like an oral automatism, so lip smacking, right? All of us could lip smack on command, but we're referring to that moment where it's not an intentional movement. Autonomic, so autonomic is, like everything we feel. You get hot, you get flushed, you feel nauseous. This is where that word psychic from earlier comes in. People will get seizures where it's like a really intense deja vu. And so back in the day, they used to refer to these as a psychic seizure because deja vu, right? Kind of like a weird feeling. But all of that falls under the umbrella of your autonomic nervous system. A behavioral arrest, I think, is self-explanatory, right? That just means that you suddenly pause. And sensory also encompasses almost everything. Think about what our senses do. We have vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch. So any impairment that falls under those senses being off involves a sensory seizure. Okay, told you we were done with terminology. Any questions, actually, before I move into this part? Okay, you can interrupt me too. All right, so we're back to our beautiful little slide here. All I want you to take away from this slide are the first two bubbles here, the focal and the generalized. This gets very confusing for a lot of people who have focal epilepsy, but they often go into a generalized seizure. And so it can get really confusing because they do have a generalized seizure. And so that's why I wanted to break it up a little bit. The only real difference here is where does it start? If it's a generalized seizure, we're starting, the whole brain's kind of lighting up. If it's a focal seizure, it's starting in one spot. Now, how fast that spreads is variable, and that gives us a lot of the symptoms that we see. But that's what we're thinking about, is where does it start? So let's look at semiology, our fancy word. So think about it. Our brain does everything that we do, right? Every single thing we're doing every day is in our brain. Which means that wherever the seizure starts or whatever area is affected, you're going to get a response that mimics what that part of the brain does. So for example, if you have a temporal lobe focal seizure, often you'll get impairment to your speech because that is where most of our speech comes from. So people who are still kind of aware, but they can't get the words out, or they're coming out, but they don't quite make sense. If somebody says that to me, because I know that that's what the temporal lobe does, without any testing, my mind should automatically say they're probably having a temporal seizure, right? So that's where it gets very interesting. And again, you don't have to memorize any of this. I actually have this picture hanging above my desk at home. But it's very interesting if you look through and say, okay, that seems like, let's take occipital lobe. Man, I always have a weird visual distortion. Now, is that a guarantee that that's where it's starting? No, but it clues us in a little bit. And why does that matter? It matters as we get into the treatment side of it. So it matters understanding more about where our seizures start when we get to that part. So here's my pretty little dot that just shows that our seizures starting in one spot. So we have a focal aware and a focal unaware. Pretty self-explanatory. One you're still aware, one you're not. So some people have focal aware seizures where they don't lose awareness. They could have that automatism, the hand patting, I can't get words out, but they're still aware. So they still could go ahead and finish driving if that's what they were doing. It's a whole other topic. But it never goes on to that loss of awareness. And then you have focal unaware, which now means that it's spreading to some kind of a gap or loss of consciousness. Questions on that part? Okay. I'm not going to go through all this, but this is also just kind of that breakdown. So when we're referring to seizures, we're going to have these little bubbles right here, aware, not aware, and then they break down into what symptoms you're having when you have a seizure. We're not going to go through it again, bring it back, because now we're going to transition to our second column. That's the generalized seizure. So a generalized epilepsy, none of you have to learn how to read this EEG, I promise. But can anybody tell me what looks off about it? Anybody? Go for it. You see that little column right there where it's like all the way down, the whole thing, if you drew a line, you kind of have some weird squigglies and then it all calms down. You guys see that? Guessing I put it on a timed setting. There we go. So why this matters is this means that at the exact same time, every spot in your brain just lit up, not one. I didn't have a beautiful focal one in the brain, so I didn't. But if you were having a focal seizure, everything would still look like this, and only a couple of these lines. Does that kind of make sense? I know we're getting into like the weeds here, but good to know. So we have a couple different types of a generalized seizure. So we have a convulsive seizure, right? That's our tonic-clonic movements. We have non-convulsive seizures like an absence seizure, where I think probably a lot of people in here are familiar with this one, but that's where you just kind of zone out for a minute. We have the myoclonic seizure. Those are those really quick jerks. So not a big rhythmic, ongoing like a convulsion, just a quick little unintentional muscle jerk. And then we have the atonic that we mentioned earlier. That's the drop seizure. That's where our muscles just for a second just let go. Go back. Okay, there we go. So these ones go back into more youth because typically these are going to start in childhood or in adolescent years. But I wanted to bring it up in case there's anybody here who kind of falls under this category or knows someone who does. These are the three main types of generalized epilepsy. So there's an absence epilepsy where that's all they have. They only have absence epilepsy. They've never had a convulsion or anything else. Then you have like a juvenile idiopathic epilepsy that can include a little bit more of the different seizure types. And juvenile myoclonic epilepsy means that you have absence seizures, you have convulsive seizures, and you have myoclonic seizures. So if you have three different seizure types in those, that would be the category it falls in, and we often abbreviate it to JME. What's interesting with this is sometimes it's not diagnosed until adulthood because the person hasn't had a convulsive seizure yet. So what I hear and see almost every day is somebody coming in and saying to me that they had their first time convulsive seizure. And then I start asking them, what kind of kid were you? How'd you do in school? And they're like, man, I was always in trouble. My teacher said I did not pay attention. I just would daydream all the time. And that's a pretty common occurrence, actually, that we just missed it. And I think we're doing better as knowledge is growing. I think teachers are on the lookout for this, but it happens a lot. So that's why I kind of loop it in there a little bit on the adult side. Questions about this part before I go on? Okay. Seizure triggers. This is the audience participation. I'd love for you to add to this. This is certainly not an all-encompassing list. Hands down, sleep deprivation. Why do you guys think sleep deprivation is such a big trigger for epilepsy? There you go. The brain doesn't have its time when it sleeps to do what it's supposed to do and heal. And there's an actual shift in the balance of your neurotransmitters when you are sleep deprived. All of us kind of go through our everyday just being like, yeah, that's a part of life. But it is a shift. Next one, I'm jumping over a couple, stress. Those are the most common triggers is stress and sleep deprivation. And the stress is the same reason. We downplay stress every day, and that's a whole other presentation. We all just have accepted that acute stress is a part of life, and it is. But when you are stressed, that is an actual process that is happening in your brain. So it's not just a feeling, it is something happening. And it does sort of shift the balance in people who have epilepsy and makes them more likely to have that breakthrough seizure. The hard part is that's probably the hardest one to do something with, right? Like I can tell you, hey, try really hard to get a good sleep schedule. Me saying, hey, go out and stop being stressed, that's a little harder. Those things are sometimes out of our control, but it's good to be aware of. And then we have a few other. For women who are in here, menstrual cycle and hormonal changes absolutely can have an impact on breakthrough seizures, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Flashing lights. A lot of people know about this. Interestingly, it's actually a really, really small number of people that are triggered by flashing lights, which is why I find it fascinating that it's the most well-known trigger. However, it's a trigger, right? Everybody knows this. They even put which is good. They put the alerts, like I just watched The Incredibles 2 with my kids the other day, and they have an alert because there's a scene in there that really is pretty strobe lighty, which is great that they do this, but